What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors walks into what should be a simple interview, only to face a host spiraling into ego and entitlement? In just 32 seconds of unhinged comments, Anderson Cooper turned a friendly conversation into a battleground that would end with Pedro Pascal doing something no guest had ever done before, walking off the set in the middle of a live broadcast. The studio lights were bright that evening, almost blinding, as Pedro Pascal settled into the guest chair across from Anderson Cooper. The audience applauded warmly. Pedro smiled that genuine smile he's known for, the one that reaches his eyes and makes you feel like you're talking to an old friend. He was there to discuss his latest project, a film about immigration that had been getting incredible buzz at festivals. It was personal work, something Pedro had poured his heart into. Anderson opened with what seemed like a standard question. So Pedro, this film of yours, it's about immigration. That's quite the hot topic right now. Pedro nodded, leaning forward slightly. It is, and it's important to me because my family, we came to the United States when I was very young. We were refugees from Chile. This story, it's not just a movie to me. It's about real people, real families who are searching for safety and a better life. Right, Anderson said, but there was something in his tone, something dismissive. But don't you think Hollywood has done this story to death? I mean, how many immigration films do we really need? The audience went quiet. You could feel the shift in energy. Pedro's smile faltered just a bit, but he remained composed. I don't think we can ever tell too many human stories, Anderson. These aren't just statistics or political talking points. These are people's lives. Anderson waved his hand, actually waved it like he was brushing away Pedro's words. Sure, but let's be honest here. You're doing this for the awards, aren't you? The Academy loves this kind of thing. It's practically Oscar bait. Pedro's jaw tightened. That's not why I made this film. Come on, Anderson said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. You're telling me that you, a successful actor, decided to make a movie about immigration purely out of the goodness of your heart? There's no calculation there? No thinking about how this plays during award season? Anderson, I'm telling you that this film matters because the people in it matter. My family's story matters. The stories of millions of families matter. Anderson laughed. Actually laughed. You actors are all the same. You wrap yourselves in these noble causes. But at the end of the day, it's about the trophy, isn't it? The audience was uncomfortable now. People were shifting in their seats. This wasn't the usual playful banter of a talk show. This was something else entirely. Pedro took a deep breath. I think you're projecting something onto me that isn't there. I came here to talk about the film, about the work we did, about the stories we wanted to tell. Projecting? Anderson's voice went up an octave. I'm just asking the questions that everyone at home is thinking. You don't get to come on my show and act like you're above criticism? I never said I was above criticism, Pedro replied, his voice steady but firm. But you're not criticizing the film. You haven't asked me a single question about the actual work. You're attacking my motives, and you don't know anything about my motives. Anderson leaned forward now, and his expression had changed. There was an edge to it, something almost cruel. I know plenty. I know that you're just another actor trying to stay relevant. The Mandalorian is over, The Last of Us is done filming, and now you need something to keep your name in the headlines. The audience gasped. Several people said, "Oh my God," out loud. Pedro sat back, stunned. Wow. Okay, so that's what this is. That's what is, Anderson challenged. This ambush. I thought I was coming here for a conversation. Instead, you're trying to tear me down on live television. Anderson scoffed. Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. I'm just doing my job. Your job is to interview people, not to insult them. I'm asking tough questions, Anderson shot back. Maybe you're just not used to being challenged. Maybe everyone in Hollywood just tells you how wonderful you are all the time, and you can't handle someone being real with you. Pedro shook his head slowly. Being real? Anderson, you don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what my family has been through. And you're sitting here, in your position of privilege, telling me that my story doesn't matter. That telling stories about immigration is overdone. That I'm just doing it for awards. Do you hear yourself? Don't lecture me about privilege, Anderson snapped. I've worked hard to get where I am. I'm not saying you haven't, Pedro said, his voice rising now. But you're using your platform to belittle important work. You're using your show to mock the idea that stories about refugees and immigrants have value. Do you understand how that sounds? Anderson stood up. Actually stood up from his chair. How dare you come on my show and tell me how to do my job? I've been doing this for decades. Pedro stood up too. And in all those decades, did you ever stop to think that maybe, just maybe, you should listen more and judge less? I don't need to take this from you, Anderson said, his face flushed. You're a guest on my show. You don't get to turn this around on me. I'm not turning anything around, Pedro said, his voice calm again, which somehow made it more powerful. I'm simply defending myself against someone who invited me here under false pretenses. You didn't want to talk about the film. You wanted to tear me down. I just don't understand why. Anderson pointed at Pedro, actually pointed his finger at him like a weapon. Because people like you think you're so special. You think because you're famous, because you're in movies, that you have some moral authority. You come on shows like this and you preach, and you expect everyone to just nod along. I haven't preached anything, Pedro said quietly. I've talked about a film about human beings seeking safety. If that threatens you somehow, and that says more about you than it does about me. The audience erupted in applause. Actual applause for Pedro, right there in Anderson's studio. Anderson's face went from flushed to bright red. How dare you turn my audience against me? Anderson hissed. I didn't do anything, Pedro said. They're reacting to what they're seeing, what they're hearing. Anderson turned to his producers off camera. Cut his mic right now. But Pedro's microphone stayed on. The producers weren't following Anderson's orders. Anderson turned back to Pedro, and his voice was shaking with rage. You know what your problem is? You're just another Hollywood liberal who thinks he's better than everyone else. You make your little movies, and you collect your little paychecks, and you pretend to care about the little people. But you don't. You don't care about anyone but yourself. The studio went completely silent. Pedro stared at Anderson for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. I came from nothing, Anderson. My family fled a dictatorship. We had nothing when we arrived in this country. Nothing. My parents worked jobs that nobody else wanted to work. They sacrificed everything so that my sister and I could have opportunities. So when I make a film about immigration, about refugees, about families trying to survive, it's not some calculated move. It's not Oscar bait. It's my life. It's my family's life. And the fact that you can sit there and mock that, the fact that you can dismiss it as some kind of Hollywood game, it tells me everything I need to know about you. Anderson opened his mouth to respond, but Pedro held up his hand. I'm not finished. You invited me here. You asked me to come on your show. And instead of having a conversation, instead of showing even basic respect, you've spent the entire time attacking me, attacking my work, attacking my integrity, and now you're attacking my politics, my beliefs, everything. For what? For ratings? To make yourself feel superior? I don't have to listen to this, Anderson said. No, you don't, Pedro agreed. But your audience does. And they're listening. They're watching. And they're seeing exactly who you are right now. Anderson's hands were shaking. Get out. Get off my show. Pedro smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was sad, disappointed. I was planning to. He unclipped his microphone, set it carefully on the chair, and started to walk toward the exit. Anderson called after him, his voice breaking. "You're making a huge mistake. Do you know what I can do to your career? Do you know how much power I have?" Pedro stopped, turned around, looked Anderson right in the eyes. "That right there, that's the problem. You think this is about power. You think you can threaten me, intimidate me, make me back down. But I've faced real threats, Anderson. I've seen real power used against innocent people. And compared to that, you're nothing." The audience erupted again. This time, it wasn't just applause. People were on their feet. Some were cheering. Anderson looked around, seeing his own audience celebrating a guest who was walking out on him. His expression crumbled. "You can't do this. You can't just leave." "Watch me," Pedro said simply. "If you walk out that door, you'll never work in this industry again. I'll make sure of it." Pedro laughed. Actually laughed. "Anderson, listen to yourself. You sound like a villain in a bad movie. You're threatening my career because I won't sit here and let you insult me and my family? Really?" "I'm not insulting your family," Anderson stammered. "Yes, you are. You're insulting everything they went through, everything they sacrificed. You're saying their story doesn't matter. You're saying stories like theirs have been told too many times. You're saying I'm exploiting their trauma for awards. How is that not insulting them?" Anderson had no answer. He just stood there, his face red, his hands shaking, looking around at his audience, who was still on their feet for Pedro. Pedro shook his head. "I feel sorry for you, Anderson. I really do. Because you had a chance tonight to have a real conversation. You could have asked me about the making of the film. You could have asked about the actors I worked with, many of whom are immigrants themselves, some of whom shared their own families' stories. You could have asked about the research we did, the communities we talked to. You could have asked meaningful questions. But instead, you chose this. You chose to be cruel. You chose to be dismissive. You chose to try to make me look small so you could feel big. And it backfired." "I was just doing my job," Anderson said weakly. "No," Pedro said firmly. "Your job is to inform, to entertain, to create dialogue. What you did tonight was none of those things. What you did was bully someone because you could, or because you thought you could." Pedro turned to the audience. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening. If you get a chance to see the film, I hope you will. Not because of anything that happened here tonight, but because the stories in it deserve to be heard. Because the people in it deserve to be seen." The audience applauded again, louder this time. Pedro looked back at Anderson one more time. "I hope you take some time to think about why you acted the way you did tonight. I hope you ask yourself if this is really who you want to be." Anderson's voice was barely a whisper. "Get out." "I'm going," Pedro said. "But I'm not leaving because you told me to. I'm leaving because staying here, sitting across from someone who has so much contempt for me and what I care about, that's not good for me. That's not healthy. And I've learned in my life that you don't have to accept being treated badly. You can walk away." He started toward the exit again. Anderson called out one more time, his voice desperate now. "You're going to regret this." Pedro stopped at the door, his hand on the handle. He looked back over his shoulder. "The only thing I regret is that there are probably other guests you've treated this way. People who didn't feel like they could defend themselves. People who just sat there and took it because they thought they had to. I regret that I didn't know about that before I came here. Because if I had known, I never would have agreed to this." And then he walked out. The door closed behind him, and the studio was chaos. The audience was buzzing, talking among themselves. Anderson stood alone on his stage, looking lost. One of the producers rushed onto the set, trying to salvage something. "We're going to take a quick break. she announced to the audience. But it was too late. The damage was done. Anderson Cooper, the polished professional, the seasoned interviewer, had shown a side of himself that nobody had seen before. He had been cruel, dismissive, entitled. He had tried to use his position to diminish someone, and it had blown up in his face spectacularly. In the hallway outside the studio, Pedro was surrounded by staff members, some apologizing, some asking if he was okay. He assured them he was fine, because he was. He had stood up for himself, for his work, for his family. He had refused to be bullied on live television. Back in the studio, Anderson sat in his chair, his head in his hands. The audience was still there, still talking, still processing what they had just witnessed. Some of them were filming on their phones. This would be everywhere within hours. One audience member shouted out, "You owe him an apology." Others joined in. "That was wrong. You attacked him for no reason. He was right to leave." Anderson looked up at his audience, his face a mask of confusion and anger, and something that might have been shame. "I was just asking questions," he said weakly. But nobody was buying it. They had all seen what happened. They had heard every word, every insult, every dismissive comment. They had watched Anderson go from interviewer to antagonist in real time. The producer came back on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end tonight's show early. Thank you for being here." The audience booed. Actually booed. They wanted to see more. They wanted Anderson to address what had just happened. But Anderson was already unhooking his microphone, already standing up to leave his own show. As the audience filed out, all anyone could talk about was Pedro. How calm he had stayed. How eloquently he had defended himself. How he had refused to back down, even when threatened. How he had walked away with his dignity intact. And Anderson? Anderson had revealed something ugly about himself. Something petty and mean. He had let his ego and his sense of entitlement take over, and it had cost him. In trying to make Pedro look bad, he had only made himself look worse. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Pedro, the actor who had come from nothing, who had worked his way up, who used his platform to tell meaningful stories, had shown grace under pressure. Anderson, the established host with decades of experience, had shown pettiness and cruelty. In the green room, Pedro gathered his things. His publicist rushed in, phone already ringing off the hook. "Are you okay?" she asked. "What happened in there?" Pedro zipped up his bag. "He got nasty. I wasn't going to sit there and take it." "Do you want to put out a statement?" Pedro thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "No. What happened in there speaks for itself. People saw it. That's enough." His publicist nodded, but she looked worried. "Anderson has a lot of influence. He could make things difficult." Pedro smiled, that genuine smile again. "Let him try. I've dealt with difficult before. I'm not afraid of him." And he wasn't. And because Pedro Pascal had something that Anderson Cooper seemed to have lost somewhere along the way. Integrity. He knew who he was. He knew what mattered to him. And he wasn't willing to compromise that for anyone, no matter how powerful they thought they were. As Pedro left the building, stepping out into the cool evening air, he felt lighter. Yes, the interview had been a disaster. Yes, there would be fallout. But he had stood up for himself. He had spoken his truth. He had refused to be diminished. And somewhere inside that building, Anderson Cooper was learning a hard lesson. That power without empathy is just bullying. That a platform without responsibility is just noise. And that trying to make yourself look big by making others look small is the smallest thing a person can do. The night air was crisp and clean. So Pedro took a deep breath and smiled. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But tonight, he knew he had done the right thing. He had walked away from toxicity. He had chosen self-respect over politeness. He had shown that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's cruelty. And as he walked down the street, disappearing into the New York night, Pedro Pascal had no idea that what had just happened would change everything. Not for him, because he would continue making meaningful work and telling important stories, but for Anderson Cooper, who had revealed something about himself that he could never take back. The interview that was supposed to promote a film about humanity and compassion had instead become a masterclass in what happens when ego overtakes empathy, when power corrupts perspective, when someone forgets that the person sitting across from them is a human being deserving of respect. Pedro had walked into that studio as a guest. He had walked out as something more, a person who refused to accept being treated as less than, and in doing so, he had shown everyone watching what real strength looks like. Not the strength to dominate or intimidate, but the strength to walk away, the strength to say no, the strength to maintain dignity in the face of hostility. That strength resonated with everyone who witnessed what happened, because at some point, everyone has been in a situation where they were treated poorly by someone who had power over them. Everyone has had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to fight back or take it, whether to leave or endure. But Pedro chose to speak up. He chose to fight back with words and truth. He chose to leave rather than endure. And in making those choices, he gave permission to everyone watching to do the same in their own lives. The studio lights were turned off now. The audience had gone home. The cameras had stopped rolling. But the impact of those 32 seconds, when everything fell apart, when Anderson's mask slipped and his true colors showed, that would last much longer. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one comment, one person refusing to accept unacceptable behavior, and everything changes. Pedro Pascal had that moment, and he used it not to attack, not to retaliate, but simply to draw a line and say, this far and no further. I deserve better than this. My work deserves better than this. In my family's story deserves better than this. And he was right. The question that lingered in the air as the building emptied and the night grew late was not what would happen to Pedro. He would be fine. His talent, his integrity, his body of work spoke for itself. The question was, what would happen to Anderson? How do you come back from something like that? How do you rebuild trust with an audience that saw you be cruel for no reason? How do you explain away behavior that seemed to come from such a deep place of ego and entitlement? These were questions Anderson would have to answer, but they weren't Pedro's problem. Pedro had walked out that door and left all of it behind. He had chosen himself, his dignity, his peace of mind over a toxic situation. And that choice, that simple but powerful choice, one was why Pedro Pascal was the hero of this story. Not because he was perfect, but because when faced with someone trying to tear him down, he refused to be torn down. He stood tall. He spoke truth. And when words weren't enough, he walked away. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. And Pedro Pascal proved that in just 32 seconds of watching Anderson Cooper spiral into cruelty, followed by minutes of standing firm against attacks and insults and threats, ending with that final walk to the door and out into the night. What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors faces a host determined to tear him down? He shows everyone watching what real class looks like, what real strength is, what real dignity means. Pedro Pascal walked off that set. But he walked away with something Anderson Cooper lost that night: the respect and admiration of everyone who witnessed what happened. And that, in the end, is worth more than any interview, any show, any platform could ever be.